There's an unavoidable element of selectivity in governing, right? Like you can't do everything all at once. So you got to tackle your stuff, right? And
Yeah.
the stuff that you choose to tackle and prioritize is going to be driven by a lot of factors, including your ideological commitments, but also your political obligations, your political debts, right? Who you have to make happy in order to get reelected. And so there's going to be a kind of partisanship in that, right? Like Republicans are going to push for tax cuts, right? Like that's kind of what they do. Democrats are going to push for, environmental legislation, pieces there. Okay, fine. That's normal. That's normal politics. There comes a point though, or there's a way of going about this selectivity where it starts to look more worrisome from a rule of law perspective. And I guess if I had to characterize what that point or line is, it's something to do with kind of arbitrary or selective enforcement. Um, suppose, for instance, that Trump was to say, Trump was to order the IRS to selectively audit, Democrats, like in the same way that the Democrats selectively targeted different Republican organizations through the IRS. That I think is very objectionable, right? That's a kind of egregious violation of the rule of law.
Matt Zwolinski, welcome.
Max, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be talking with you.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna get into it today. What prompted this particular episode is perhaps something of a disagreement with varying degrees of good faith on my part. Um, I was in a mood to, as we might say, wrestle that day, and nevertheless, you were extremely gentlemanly in your response, reached out about it. I critiqued your article about more or less shrinking the state, what that means, why we should do it, and the mode and manner of shrinking it. We have some disagreements about that. Not that it should be shrunk. I'll let folks know, but rather that um, maybe some disagreements on how it's supposed to unfold, maybe deriving a theory about it, but maybe not necessarily sitting on our hands until that theory rolls out. Is that more or less your perspective on it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I have a long kind of history in the libertarian movement as a libertarian philosopher. My what drew me into philosophy when I was an undergraduate was I think Ayn Rand at first, but from there it was just a series of questions about what the proper size and scope of the state are, what an ideal society would look like in terms of individual liberty versus coercion. And I've had many conversations with a lot of people about these issues, a lot of great conversations, read a lot of great books and articles about these things. But one thing that struck me as getting less attention than it should from a lot of libertarians was the question of how to get to our ideal society once we figured out what that ideal society looks like, right? So libertarians love to debate about anarchism versus minarchism, right? Like what kinds of things the state should do and what kinds of things it shouldn't do. But of course, the actual state that we have and the actual state that like everybody in the world has right now looks nothing like the kind of state that libertarians say they want. So we're a long ways off from our goal, whatever our goal is. So how do we move in the direction of freedom? What are the steps that we can take to shrink the state? That question I think is important. And with the activities of Doge earlier this year, I think that kind of brought some of those questions to the forefront, at least for me. And so I wrote this article to try to set out some of the questions that I think we should be thinking about in starting to, formulate a kind of overarching theory of, how to shrink the state, right? Libertarians have a theory of what the state should look like. We need a theory of how to get there.
What's interesting about that, I mean, and I absolutely agree. On this, I think we fundamentally agree that libertarians do a pretty bad job of figuring out how to get to the destination and thinking of it as a destination, as if it were some sort of moment, like a constitutional moment or a historical moment, and then it's just going to be there. So I think that that concept is fraught for many libertarians, but also the idea that um, that they tend to imagine the ideal, try to describe what it ought to be, and never spend a time unpacking what does it mean to actually get there given the circumstances we're in. And that's, I think you put it beautifully there. The other interesting thing is libertarians, I would like to credit Buchanan and Tulloch as being libertarians who did such a great job of helping us understand the other direction, how we tend to back ourselves, even as a relatively free constitutional republic. The founders, the American founders, one might consider at least proto-libertarians, and their first approximation at what a free society would look like in roughly after the revolution, but also after 1789 with the Constitutional Convention. They had a bunch of debates. Turns out they made a great effort. They made a great republic, but they were wrong. There seems to be ways in which the original founding project has not um, has not reached full flower in the ways that the founders might have hoped. And so Buchanan and Tulloch, the sort of primary architects of public choice theory, I mean, they've had some influences, of course, but I think they're among the greatest exponents of public choice theory. Basically, tell us how the state tends to grow and grow, how, coupling sort of unholy alliances between special interests in the state, log rolling, all the dynamics around what causes a state to grow. And you point this out in your article. It's an incentive system that seems almost inevitable and can lead some of us to be nihilistic. So I think your call, generally speaking, for the idea of how to roll that back with a theory that is as powerful as public choice is on point, and I want to acknowledge that and grant it. But there are specific things that you in today find objectionable about the way people are going about it, and let's talk about that for a little while, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Right. I think, as I said, there are better and worse ways of rolling back the state. Um, and another issue, kind of related to this, is that you know, my libertarianism has kind of, I guess, evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective over the years. Um, and the way I think about things now is, I was really influenced by this thing that Steve Horowitz, the late economist, once said, which is that there's a difference between being anti-state and being pro-liberty, among libertarians, right? Like, they're obviously connected. If you are at all libertarian, you're going to recognize that states can and have and will pose serious threats to individual liberty. So if you're pro-freedom, you're going to be anti-state in some respect. But it's a question of what's fundamental to you, right? It's like, are you fundamentally against the state, or are you fundamentally in favor of human liberty? Because sometimes those things come apart. And my belief is that some of the things that states do are actually quite important and conducive to human liberty. So I've never been an anarchist, and I think that's one point on which you and I disagree. Um, but I'm sort of increasingly attracted to this idea of state capacity, and the fact that, if you think that there's anything that the state ought to do, even if it's just police, courts, and military, then it's going to be really important that the states have the ability to do those things well, um, and simply stripping functions from the state, kind of willy nilly, will in some cases undermine its capacity to perform whatever functions you think it ought to be performing. And obviously, people are going to disagree about, what those functions are. Um, but the idea that, that there's some capacity there that might actually be not a threat to liberty, but actually an important prerequisite of liberty. That's something that I've come to appreciate more. And so I think it throws an extra point of caution in how we go about dismantling the state, right? Like you want to strip the functions that are bad, not the functions that are actually, holding the whole machine together, in performing its useful
So
function.
let's, at the risk of walking away as our perhaps natural lot as theorists, try to dig down into some details. What is it that, and this is not, by the way, to conjure the debate between minarchism and anarchism. I think you might appreciate my position as being that we have to be pragmatic. We have to use Bayesian thinking and OODA loops at all times in a continuous way to be directional about freedom. And so what I would, I call my position asymptotic anarchy. Yes, I think that it would be a very good idea for the functions of the state not to be a monopoly, but to be competitive such that you achieve some manner of equilibrium and the competitive nature of it, at least through some time period, assures that we have somewhere to go. The monopoly, the competitive forces mean you have a right of exit. When you have a monopoly, the monopolies tend to be problematic. Even oligopolies do, but certainly a monopoly does. There's nowhere to go. There's no competition. So it's not that I don't want to see the functions of the government, for example, policing and military and so on, go away. It's that I want them to subject them to the dynamism and competitive forces of the market. And that maybe separates me in some sense from others who believe that there should simply be no state or functions of the state that are competitive. But I define anarchism in this sense as important functions that are competitive and market-based rather than monopolistic, such as violence, the use of violence, the threat of violence, and indeed the application of law. So we're not having an argument about that today. What we both acknowledge is that we want directionally to go in the same direction, which is a liberatory direction and and a direction that both enhances freedom in the sense of Horwitz, but also minimizes or reduces the amount of threats of violence in the world. It's not, amount is probably the wrong way of putting it, but the level of
Yeah.
violence and threat of violence in the world, and the preponderance or emergence of cooperation, exchange, and voluntary association that can flower in the presence of such good institutions, however we imagine them. So that leads us back into this question of specificity. What, in your mind, is a bad way to go about it? Shrinking the state? Or what are people failing to heed when they shrink the state in the wrong ways that you want people to understand?
Yeah. So, I think, there's a lot to say about that question. I'm trying to think of what the most useful way of addressing it would be for purposes of our conversation. One thing that kind of came up in your piece, that I didn't really address in mine was the case of Javier Milei in Argentina. So I laid some criticism on Doge in the United
Mhm.
States. I didn't talk about Malay at all in my piece. But I did kind of reference the chainsaw though, right? And I said that hacking away with the state with a chainsaw probably isn't the best way of going about things. But I actually think there are some interesting and useful contrasts to be drawn between um, between Musk and Doge in the United States and Malay's efforts in Argentina. And the short version of the story is I'm considerably more optimistic about Malay's project than I ever was about Doge here in the United States. I think there's a lot of superficial similarities between the two approaches, a lot of similarities in rhetoric, right? I mean, Malay did bring the chainsaw to the United States and handed it to Elon Musk on stage. Um, right. So they talk a kind of similar talk. But I think that really is a pretty superficial similarity, and that actually what Malay did and is doing and what Doge was doing are two very different projects in a lot of ways. Um, so that might be worth exploring, right? And one sort of obvious sense in which they're different is that uh, yeah, Malay's a libertarian, right? Like Malay has a long history as a libertarian economist before he ever came to wield state power. He knows who Hayek is and who Rothbard is, and he can expound at great length and at great sophistication on their ideas. Um, Trump is not a libertarian, right? Like by any whatever Angela McArdle might have said at the Libertarian Party, like he is not a libertarian. I don't think he's a friend to libertarians. Libertarians have kind of latched on in hopeful anticipation to some of the things that he has done, and I think some of them got very excited about Doge for that reason. But
I'm one.
Doge,
I'm one
Doge
to get
was ne-
excited about Doge.
yeah, I mean, I got a little excited myself at first, but I think the fact of the matter is, right, like it 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 is there's something foolish about expecting a libertarian project from a president who is certainly by no stretch of the imagination a libertarian, and I think in many ways quite hostile to many kind of core elements of libertarianism. Um, so that's the kind of the fundamental difference between these two projects, right? It's like one of them was driven by a person with a real commitment to libertarian values and libertarian goals. The other one simply wasn't, and that's part of what explains why they played out so differently. And we can talk about what some of those differences are, but that's my kind of opening
So
distinction between the two.
let me just reflect back what I thought I heard you say, which is that essentially that what made you skeptical about Doge as a project is that not that that Doge's efforts in whatever way it could to cut back or roll back the gargantuan nature of the state would not be welcome, but rather that it would be too selective because Trump would be behind it. So it would be so the cuts would essentially be in service of his agenda or a partisan agenda, not in service of some sort of greater theory of shrinking the state. Is that the objection?
Yeah, I think that's about right, right? So I think Doge was never really a libertarian reform movement. It was never about fundamentally shrinking the state. And I think Malay's efforts were and
Yeah,
are.
I see. I and I'd said this in response to your article. I mean, what you had said was basically that it was that you had suggested that it was kind of a partisan show, that it was just red meat for Trump's base, for the MAGA base, and that it wasn't really a good faith effort to prune the state. Um, and I disagreed with you on that. I thought, and I think one of the reasons that I now in practical terms, you turned out to be right in your assessment. but I think not in terms of motivation. And I also realize that consequences are probably in this context more important than motivations. But you did, if I recall, ascribe motivations to Trump and Elon that were basically, it's all meant to toss red meat to the base, but and to create a kind of partisan window dressing, but not really to actually do anything. Turns out that's largely correct, and I readily admit and admitted in my response to you that the big beautiful bill, or the big behemoth boondoggle, or whatever you want to call it, was certainly something that Trump supported and wanted to see, notwithstanding the efforts Doge, I think, was going to make to cut back the state. You said something earlier about that it seemed like they were cutting things willy-nilly. And while that may be true, I also think that the state gets added to willy-nilly. So to me, there's nothing particularly objectionable in any, under any political theory that I can think of. You have some. We may not agree about those, but there's nothing particularly objectionable about cutting back things that were added willy-nilly, and certainly things that were added under the dubious auspices of a pre-Chevron world in which basically Congress handed these agencies a blank check to do whatever the hell they wanted. And it was ghastly, some of the stuff they discovered. You and I might not agree on whether those things were ghastly, but in my mind they were. And I think the fight between Elon and Trump after that, where they had the falling out, was Trump saying, WTF. I'm sorry, Elon saying, WTF. Why are you trying to do this big, beautiful bill when we're fighting here in the trenches against the swamp creatures, against the supplicants, against the hangers-on and the useless eaters and the people who are out there doing all this dubious stuff with taxpayer money that it's actually just debt spending that completely contradicts and runs counter to our efforts here at Doge. It makes us look like a fool. Now, some would argue that Elon has ulterior motives. He wants his trips to Mars funded and all this and that, and because he would never be able to raise the capital to do so on his own. Maybe that's true, but I wonder. I have wondered, not just because of you, and I treated you as a little bit of a punching bag for all of the libertarians I've seen have similar views on the idea that Doge was undertaken in the wrong way. It's like we have this moment, Doge comes together less than a year before Trump is maybe going to get elected, and they see what Javier Milei has done, and I think that they saw that as an exemplar, what he has done successfully, and they saw that as an exemplar. And they made more cuts and shed more government than we have seen since perhaps Bill Clinton and Al Gore did it in that administration in the 90s. So, yeah, there's got to be a question here. I'm going to get to it. So why wouldn't, your position, as I understand it, is that we need to have a better theory about how to roll back the state before we just go in and hacking and slashing. And my rejoinder to that was Javier Milei went in and hacked and slashed. And I have no idea whether and to what extent his efforts were actually selective, pedantic proceduralism, the term that I used for people who think that it has to be some sort of perfect platonic thing, or that it has to be things that I want cut, but not other things that I don't want cut in order to roll back the state. So where am I going wrong, or how do you disagree, and help me understand that? I think one of the points was a point about morality, about moral prioritizing things that might have some questionably moral objections.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah.
It's just if I'll just start addressing things at random here, but one of the things that you said kind of early on was that we want to draw a distinction between motivations and outcomes, and I just want to accede that like the motivations here are complex and opaque. So I can speculate on what various people's motivations were, but I mean I really have no idea.
Same.
As you said, there's a lot going on with Elon, right? There's I'm sure some genuine public spiritedness there. There's also some interests in protecting his own financial interests. And of course, Elon wasn't the only person in Doge, right? So there were a lot of people involved in that project, many of whom probably had other motivations. So I don't know. But I think the guiding, both the kind of guiding spirit of the project as emanating from Donald Trump, and the scope of the project was set up in such a way that dramatic and long-term reductions in the size and scope of government were never really on the table. Right. First, because I don't think that was what Trump actually wanted, as evidenced by like everything he's done as president. And second, because and this is something we haven't quite gotten to yet, but the idea that you're going to shrink the government by targeting waste, fraud, and abuse, I think is a deeply mistaken idea, right?
Okay.
There's just not that much of it to go around. Like there is, like, and you can come up with really dramatic stories of people who were getting benefits that weren't supposed to get benefits. Like I think there was something like $100 billion in faulty Medicaid payments in 2024, and there's like $100 billion. That's like some serious money there. Um, but if you look at these things within the context of the federal budget, just the federal budget as a whole, right? Um, Not even raising the issue of the involvement in government in people's lives, right? Like, so government messes with us in various ways. It takes our money, but then it also creates all these regulations that make it hard for us to do business, hard for us to kind of just live our lives as human beings. And and Doge never touched that second thing, right? Like that was never on the agenda for Doge to get to because it couldn't. That was outside of the scope of its authority. All it could really do was go around looking for administrative bloat or wrongful payments or um, other things that I think kind of again make for a good story, but don't they're not really where the action is in terms of shrinking the government. And Malay, I think, had neither of those particular problems, right? So, the two problems of Doge were one, wasn't really interested in shrinking government, and two, wasn't really looking in the right places to shrink government. Malay both really did want to shrink government, and as president, he had the authority to pull a lot of levers, so to speak, that Doge simply didn't have access to. Um,
Right.
we can talk about that.
Okay. So there's a couple of things there that I want to try to drill down on. One is the idea that um, because I honestly don't know, did Javier Milei in particular exercise any powers that are purportedly or constitutionally outside of his authority in Argentina? Or is their system much more freewheeling when it comes to once you elect president down there, they have a lot more latitude to hack and slash relative or to add relative to some predecessor, say.
So,
Um,
so there's a lot I don't know about the Argentinian situation as well. I mean, a lot, a lot, right? Like, so for everything from, the constitutional structure of the regime down to like what actually has been happening on the ground as a result of Malay's interventions. But, like Trump, Malay, my understanding is that Malay has done a lot of things by decree, all right, sort of the analogy of executive orders in the United States. And the constitutionality of some of those decrees has been questioned. So there are some of the same kinds of procedural concerns about Malay that there are about Trump. I don't know, the degree, whether it's as much or not, but there's some of those same kinds of questions. But
Yeah.
he's been acting largely independently because the legislative branch there is largely not on board with a lot of his reforms.
Forgive this brief interruption, but I suspect you're here because you're disillusioned with legacy politics. If you're a creative, a builder, or an innovator, you might be ready to win funding. Through Human Respect Labs, you can get up to $30,000 to fund your next creative project. But not just any project. We're looking for 6 kinds of builders: video storytellers, community builders, writers, entrepreneurs, strategists, and innovators, any of which should be dedicated to human liberation. That means making government obsolete. Why? We know too much energy goes into politics, but not enough goes into real solutions. So if you're a freedom lover and you have a project idea that promotes peace, autonomy, and voluntary collaboration, we want to hear from you. Apply now at humanrespectlabs.org. That's humanrespectlabs.org. Criticize by creating. I guess one of the points of tension between you and me, and I think maybe this reveals a little bit more about my a lot of people become more conservative, more restrained in their old age. I seem to be becoming more anarchist, more fed up. But I tend to, and I also tend to think, while I understand that we can sow the seeds of future authoritarian power by, if we take a power today, if, for example, the president or the executive branch takes a power today that is purportedly in the interest of freedom, by virtue of taking that power, it has set a precedent or planted the seeds for future authoritarians to do worse. So it's like I'm seizing powers that I don't have, that I shouldn't have constitutionally, as a benign dictatorship. And I think this is really quite arguable, by the way, in the American context. I have a lot of people who I find it's bafflingly selective in what they think doesn't fall under Article 2 or isn't constitutional, and what is from the prior administration even. But more on that another time, perhaps. That there are laws and there are unjust laws, and I have a conception of justice. So while I wouldn't want to sell long-term prospects of my children down the river for short-term gains, for short-term libertarian gains, I also know that these moments don't come around very often, and they need to be seized. And if they are in the interest of justice, given just how abysmal both the executive and the Congress has been in terms of respecting the Constitution, that we're worried about so-called like civil service protections when we lay off a bunch of people from USAID who are out doing all kinds of things with money that we don't have in the name of the American voter. It's like, yeah, I kind of don't give a shit about civil service protections, even if they're somehow enshrined in statute. So does that mean that we have a permanent bureaucracy that we're supposed to just accept? If we have an executive that's willing to strip those out, why not? Because it's unconstitutional, because it's an affront to what Congress did many years ago that was probably also unconstitutional? I don't know. I don't feel like that's a very strong case. Get them out, cut their budgets, fire a bunch of them, and send them packing. That to me is not immoral. It might be willy-nilly, but to my mind, it's like we have a moment, you have to act with speed, and you have to be a little bit ruthless, because they're going to come back and cry for like piggies that have had the trough removed. And I just don't see what else could be done, except, as you point out, and I think rightly, that it be done consistently across the board. Like, let's start removing the trough over at the Department of Defense too, for example. But what am I missing about this? Why this kind of what I perceive as moralism about anything that's being cut?
Well, so let me start by telling you what you got right,
Okay,
because I think you do have a lot right here, right? So, I mean, you mentioned Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan earlier. For me, the most important um, thinker about the growth of the state is Manker Olson, whose
absolutely.
book "The Rise and Decline of Nations" I think is simply fantastic. A guy named Jonathan Rauch wrote a nice kind of popularization of Manker
Government's
Olson's
end.
book. Yeah, yeah, you know
Yep.
the book. Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know,
Demosclerosis is the first version of it, but
okay, you know this very
fabulous
well.
book.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I love the book. I think it's fantastic, and it shows why so the natural course for governments is to grow without end, and without regard to the public interest. The incentive structures are such that these things are always move in the direction of bigger and more, never in the direction of less. And so it's like you almost need some kind of radical exogenous force to come through to stop that process or reverse that process. I almost think of it akin to like a forest fire, right? And I live in California, so fires are always on my mind here. But if you don't have fires in forests after a while, you get this buildup of vegetable matter on the floor of the forest that eventually is going to lead to a really, really bad situation. And so we have these controlled burns where you let things burn for a little while. And if you don't do that, kind of nature comes along and takes things into his own hands. So I think of that a lot as a kind of analogy for shrinking the states. Like maybe you need some kind of forest fire, right? Maybe what it takes is like a war or a bankruptcy or something really catastrophic in order to reverse this natural tendency towards growth. So I don't know. I still haven't quite made up my mind about that. But the thing that troubles me about Trump and Doge more than the randomness of the cuts is the not the non-randomness of the cuts, right? Like I think a lot a lot of what Trump has done, and maybe a lot is an understatement, but a lot of what Trump has done has been about consolidating power, or that at least is how it looks to me. Um, that he is trying to consolidate as much power as possible in the presidency and eliminating countervailing sources of power in the government or rendering them neutered in a sense, um, in whatever way he can. And I think a big part of what was going on in Doge was precisely that. It was targeting sources within the government that stood as some kind of independent check on Trump's authority, that he wanted neutralized. And in that sense, it was a politically motivated operation. And you see this just like all the time with Trump, right? I mean, you saw like 2 days ago with John Bolton, right? Trump goes after people who take a stand against him, um, by whatever legal or extra legal mechanisms are available to them. He goes after inspectors general. He goes after the judiciary, judges who render rulings that he don't like. Um, this I think is very troubling because I think as as much as I care about justice, right, in some abstract sense, like I want the state to do the things that it should do and not do the things that it shouldn't do. To, I've one of the ways in which my liberalism or my libertarianism has evolved is I've almost come to think that maybe I have come to think that in some ways power is more important than justice, right? And what matters is not, right, like here's a way of thinking about the distinction. What matters is not that we get somebody in government who has the right view of justice and then we put all the power in his hands so that he could do all the right things. What I think is a much more important goal is to have countervailing sources of power, right? So that power is widely dispersed throughout government, widely dispersed throughout society, so that nobody has the ability to implement their particular view of justice or whatever on everybody else. And that's why I think markets are good, right? I think markets are an incredible source of counter. That's one of the reasons why I think markets are good. They're an incredible source of countervailing power. That's why I think the separation of powers in the federal government is important. And that's why I think that a lot of what Trump has done has been deeply worrisome. It's because it appears to be a way of attacking that that dispersion of power, these countervailing powers, and concentrating powers in the hands of one person.
So I think here's where you and I probably are drinking the talking point Kool-Aid of the respective parties more than perhaps we ought to. I don't know. Um, so I find some of the right wing critiques of the Democrats enormously persuasive in terms of the things that they did to grow government, to ensconce themselves in government, to try to achieve permanent power, to go after their political enemies. I don't think of Trump as purely a victim, but I think that the way that they went after him with lawfare was unprecedented and just trumped up proceduralism that I when I look at all of these cases and what they amounted to, it just seems like so much contrivance designed to keep him down and keep him from ever coming back to power, but also sort of spreading and deepening Democrat power. It's almost like they are the masters at accuse your enemy of doing what you're doing. And I am very, very dubious about. I think the Republicans are hypocrites, and they have no principles. They're interested in growing government, and their interests just like the Democrats are. So a pox on both their houses in this regard. But the kind of evil, dirty tricks to which they were willing to go in the Biden administration, the kind of spending and just across the board erecting the administrative state that the Democrats have done has been just unspeakable, honestly. And maybe I overstate that, and maybe between our two perspectives about Trump and what they're doing now, I actually see the Biden administration and the administrative state, the way it behaved, as being far more dangerous than what are kind of muscular and perhaps constitutionally dubious actions on the part of Trump. I don't think that they are worse in severity or scale than what came before it. Not at all. Now, I would acknowledge that that's not a good thing, that what we have created are mechanisms for partisan tit for tat as things change over, that the pendulum swing starts to come with degrees of authoritarianism, whether it's from a Politburo or a narcissistic king type. It doesn't matter. That what this always does is leave behind the residue of authoritarian means, the coercive machinations of the state to bring people to heel, to sap them of resources, to regulate them, to over police them, and so on. I share those concerns, but I don't agree about. I think you and I probably don't agree about which party or which person is worse. That being said, you wrote in your article that it was that it's something to the effect that it's not good that you're only rolling back the state when it comes to the Democrats' pet projects, but not the Republicans' pet projects. And that is absolutely true. I think that is, I think that's a problem. And I think that that is happening. But if you said to me, and this is the metaphor I used, and I just want to get your reaction to it, that Max, you're covered in ticks and leeches. We call one set Democrats, the other Republicans. And I pick the ticks off of you and leave the leeches. Why should I find that objectionable? It seems like in your mind, we should just leave both on the voter rather than picking off one set of parasites and not the other. Why is that? Why leave both in place? Why have an egalitarian view? We know that they're going to act like partisans. So can we just call that a partial win? Why not? Why leave it all in place?
Yeah, so I think I mean, I don't know what I would say about the ticks and leeches bit, but yeah, in that specific example, but I see what you're getting at, and I think the difference, if there's a difference here, is that I think that there is a important and independent norm of equal treatment that should govern uh, what the government does, right? In addition, independent of and in addition to whatever standards of justice you might have, right? So, and again, I think this is something that to some extent is I would call it a libertarian blind spot. More diplomatically, might say something that libertarians haven't maybe talked as much about as they should. But like, so libertarians are great, again, about saying like what rights people have, right? Like, these are the things the government can do to people. These are the things the government can't do to people. They don't talk quite so much about this idea of equal treatment, which I see as kind of part and parcel of a broader commitment to the rule of law, right? Equality under the law. But I think that there would be something objectionable, for instance, in a unjust law being imposed upon, say, half the population, and not on the other half. Right? Like, not that exactly that it would be better, all things considered, if the unjust law was imposed on everybody. But I think the inequality there is a source of concern in and of itself. And let me just give you an example that I think is, to my mind, quite compelling in this respect, right? So imagine you think that there shouldn't be any such thing as public schools, right? You're a principled anarchist. You think that education ought to be provided on the free market. The government ought to have nothing to do with it. Okay, fine. Even if that's right, I think it would be really, really objectionable if the government had public schools and only gave access to them to like white people, right? Or Christians or whatever. Or that like Christians and white people got like one quality of school and like other people got, a much worse quality of school. It's not like there's more injustice taking place. It's that there's like, if the government's going to be doing something, right, it ought to do it in a way that treats people equally in the relevant respect. And equality is kind of a complicated moral notion, but I think like in the case of like school segregation or something along those lines, that would be a very clear and objectionable violation of equal treatment. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think I understand what you mean, and I certainly agree with that conception of equal treatment under the broader concept of rule of law. My kids ask me what I do for work, and I say, I write, talk into a microphone, and hope people send money. Now I'm questioning my life choices, but the kids gotta eat, and we have bureaucracies to topple. Support our work at underthrow.org, and for less than $5 a month, you'll help me rouse the rabble. Wait, what's underthrow? If overthrow is violent, underthrow is peaceful yet powerful. Real change doesn't start in Washington. Casting your vote with millions is like crying a teardrop into the ocean. Instead, we build consent-based communities that make traditional power structures obsolete. Left, right, or center, it doesn't matter. What matters is creating options for opting out and opting in. We build parallel systems in which people thrive, then just leave the old systems behind. It's about choosing communities, not imposing them. So, support the show, feed my kids, read the newsletter, and discover why most subversive acts amount to building a better civilization together. Visit underthrow.org. And yet I sometimes feel like, first I think that the race-based thing is not only a disanalogy, but is perhaps pokes at something emotive that could cloud our perceptions on things. But let me just get back to that in a moment. The way I see it, and I'm trying to understand why you don't see it this way, is that you've got two different people with two different partisan perspectives. And let's just pretend that these are the only two people, and then this third person is the government, a proxy for itself, right? And so what it sounds like I'm hearing you say, or what it sounds like you're saying, is that in the interests of equality or equal application of the law, I should have, as the government, my boot on both necks. In the absence of taking the boot off one person's neck, I should just leave them on both necks. Is that your position?
I don't. I mean, it depends on what that's supposed to be an analogy for, right? I guess. Like, I don't think the government should be putting boots on people's necks. But I think there would be something extra objectionable if the government was going around putting its boots on the necks of a certain kind of person based on sort of morally irrelevant characteristics of those people, and leaving other people without boots on their neck, right? The solution to that wouldn't be like, well, put your boots on more people's necks necessarily. I don't think that would be the right way of addressing that problem. But I do think that the inequality in the application of injustice adds something to the wrongness of it.
But I guess what I'm saying is that when partisans switch power, people get fed up cyclically with one party being in power for too long. They usually act to excess. And then the electorate, in this really sad, not so tightly coupled feedback loop that we call elections, comes in and installs the other group of people because they are tired of the excesses of the party in power. The new party doesn't say, okay, now perhaps the libertarians would do this. I don't know. I don't think they could. But because for various reasons, public choice foremost. But let's say that, I mean, yes, it would be wonderful if the party that came back into power said, we're going to be force for liberation on both Republican favored issues and Democrat favored issues equally. So any given law is supposed to have equal application. And I agree about that. What I'm not seeing is like, okay, so now the Republicans are getting their goodies. They're oppressing, suppressing, and otherwise coercing people in the other party while being a slightly more liberatory force for the people in their own party or who share their values. And as soon as the Democrats get back in, they do the same thing. So to me, it's selective, and I'm guilty of it, by the way, to say, to just be quiet about all of that, and this is the metaphor for it, boots on the neck from the prior administration and power structure in Congress that's Democrat, but not with the changeover, right?
Yeah. I agree with that. So, you know, I think when I wrote my piece, I wasn't conceptualizing the equality thing in exactly the same way you are in terms of like partisan groups of Republicans and Democrats.
That's how I interpreted you. So my
fault.
Help me understand.
No.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it more in terms of different kinds of social groups, right? Right. So, but it could apply to Republicans and Democrats, but There's an unavoidable element of selectivity in governing, right? Like you can't do everything all at once. So you got to tackle your stuff, right? And
Yeah.
the stuff that you choose to tackle and prioritize is going to be driven by a lot of factors, including your ideological commitments, but also your political obligations, your political debts, right? Who you have to make happy in order to get reelected. And so there's going to be a kind of partisanship in that, right? Like Republicans are going to push for tax cuts, right? Like that's kind of what they do. Democrats are going to push for, environmental legislation, pieces there. Okay, fine. That's normal politics. There comes a point though, or there's a way of going about this selectivity where it starts to look more worrisome from a rule of law perspective. And I guess if I had to characterize what that point or line is, it's something to do with kind of arbitrary or selective enforcement. Um, so, suppose, for instance, that Trump was to say, Trump was to order the IRS to selectively audit Democrats, like in the same way that the Democrats selectively targeted different Republican organizations through the IRS. That I think is very objectionable, right? That's a kind of egregious violation of the rule of law. Or if he were to say threaten to cut
Which is
off.
exactly what of the Obama administration. I forget her name. Lerner, was it Louise Lerner?
Yeah, I forget the details, but
Anyway,
right. Yeah.
that was essentially what they were accused of at the time, going after 501c3s on the right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So that's, I think, objectionable all across the board. Whoever's doing it, that's because I mean, it's an arbitrary, this is what the rule of law is all about, right? Is making what the government does as much as possible be guided by rules, by fixed rules, and not by the arbitrary will of whoever happens to be holding power at the moment, right? And that line between arbitrary and rule based can sometimes be blurry, right? As you point out in your piece, right? Like all laws require discretion to enforce and apply, and so there's always going to be an element of individual personality coming through in these judgments. But even though
And
there are
wacky
blurry cases,
interpretation, you know,
yeah,
the living constitution kind of garbage, where sort of libertarian rule of law types are um, obliged to be cramped and restrained, while everybody else just goes absolutely. It's
yeah,
This is a structural problem, I think, that means that libertarians sort of unilaterally disarm, and the partisans don't. The two big parties don't. But I interrupted you. Please continue.
yeah. No, so I'm just, the point is that when we've got what appear to be arbitrary exercises of discretion, right? Discretion being utilized for to kind of undermine rule-based governing in favor of kind of political manipulation via selective enforcement. That kind of thing is troubling to me, and I've seen that with Democrats. I've seen that with Obama, as you pointed out. I've seen that with Biden. Um, I feel like I'm seeing it a lot more with this administration than I have in the past, and that is something that troubles me quite a bit.
Yeah, I think we just disagree about that. Maybe there are certain instances that, for some reason, are a little more troubling to me, or I'm more empathic toward
Yeah.
some of the characters that were thrown in jail. I don't know why, because I don't actually like them at all. You know, I mean, like the guy, the economist, who's a protectionist, and Don Boudreaux used to kick the shit out of him all the time on Cafe Hayek,
Uh,
who was in the administration as an economist, but they threw him in jail because he failed to show up before Congress, even though the former attorney general had failed to show up for Congress and never got a prison sentence for it. There was Roger Stone. There was the guy with the big hair who's sort of like oh, gosh, I'm sorry. I'm having anomia. It's a factor of old age, but the sort of the crazy, he's also a crazy protectionist that has he has his own podcast and was very early on a sort of ally to Trump. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, but I'm bad at keeping up on these things. So
But they were all put in prison for failing to show up to a congressional hearing. And probably what they should have done is show up and plead the fifth. But instead, what they did is they just refused to show, just as Obama's AG had done.
right, right.
This kind of, yeah. And so it was like, you're throwing people in jail now. Some of the January 6th folks, who, this some dubious shenanigans going on in terms of using the sort of FBI Gretchen Whitmer strategy. But even if you don't think that there was a conspiracy to sort of entrap people on January 6th, there was definitely a lot of people who were just grandmas who showed up and wandered onto the scene, and the cops were inviting them in and stuff like that. And these people spent 3 years in prison before they even got a trial, some of them. So I just find that, then the lawfare against Trump, the sort of deep state collusion and contrivance of the Russia stuff. There's just so many things that they did during these 4 years that were just abhorrent. And I just wonder whether, and I know this sort of retributive style of get back. It's like there was the first time around, Trump unilaterally disarmed in this regard with respect to Hillary Clinton and just let it go. And he was what he was rewarded with after having done that, because she had done some really, really shady stuff with both the Clinton Foundation and its corruption, as well as sort of the emails that she had
Yeah.
deleted that were against the law. And everybody was, they were chanting, lock her up, and stuff like that. And that seemed kind of vulgar to people from without. But once you got into the details of what she was actually being let go for, it seems like now, okay, now that Trump is back and the Trump administration is back into power, after all the stuff that these national security agencies got up to, lying, hiding, dissembling, any and everything, a lot of it illegal, that if you're the only means or mechanism enforcement, if you don't do this, you risk it being done again with greater zeal. If you do it, you risk a tit for tat struggle that changes over with administrations. And I know that's what you're fearing, at least in part. And I get that. But it is a bit of a rock and a hard place. A lot of these people, like John Brennan, need to be in jail. I mean, in my opinion, like, they need to be held accountable. And if the fact that it's Trump holding them accountable, or the Trump administration holding them accountable, kind of sucks. It's bad optics, but somebody's got to do it. Who else?
Yeah, a lot of these cases, I got to admit, I don't know as much about as I probably should, right? And again, I think we sort of hear the stories from our bubble, like as much as we try not to live in a bubble, we all do, right? So I'm hearing certain kinds of stories from my bubble, or certain kind of facts get raised as salient, and you get different ones, and so we're operating in these different kind of factual
Fair.
universes to a
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah.
And it's regrettable, and like I wish I had the time to dig into all these stories, but there's so much information out there to absorb, and there's so little that any of us can do to really even familiarize ourselves with these things, let alone dig into the kind of details that you would need to dig into to really assess them thoroughly and distinguish the from from the legitimate claims. So,
Yeah.
um, so that I don't know what to say about a lot of the claims that you raised, other than that I absolutely find it completely plausible that that there's been a lot of really bad behavior on the part of prior administrations. A lot of stuff that, some stuff that I called out, some stuff that I probably should have called out but didn't call out because I didn't know about it. Um, I'm still left with the impression, I guess, that things are substantially different here, but maybe that's, I mean, that's getting a little far off the topic of the podcast.
I try my hardest not to be someone who lives in abstraction land, and very frequently, libertarian types can do that. And I
Sure.
appreciate your both your candor and your humility about the details. And I dare say I wish I were better about details and equal application of the law of getting the details.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be a partisan. Um, but that brings us, because I think the details, however, do matter to the project of rolling back the state and how to do it and what to do in the absence of the perfect, when you only have maybe a good, like maybe this is not Doge, maybe this is not how you apply justice, but like, um, here's one. Um, Now, recently, and I don't know what to think about this. Honestly, I'm a little bit like torn. Trump has sent in police beyond the municipal police in DC to, thus far, 12 days, good effect. A lot of the denizens in the most crime-ridden areas do not perceive it as being authoritarian or racist. They see it as welcome consequence of under-policing. And matter of fact, a lot of these folks are Black, and these Black Americans um, are want to see increased policing. They just don't want to see um, undue police violence against their own, and that's perfectly reasonable, especially in the post George Floyd era, when the perception was Black folks were being hunted by the cops. I say perception because statistically, I don't think that bears out, but that's a conversation for another day. The fact that they have that perception is completely warranted, but they do want increased policing. It has also been the case with prior administrations and indeed current local administrations on the part of one party, that crime has been look the other way. Let's rein in the police. Don't enforce the law in a way that would mean a cessation to the most violent crimes, that allow people to be less fearful when they go out on the streets because they know that they have some protection, and that this has caused people to cry out authoritarianism and racism and this and that, because we are not used in America to a gendarme type of federal police force being present in municipalities. And we, myself included, and this is where I'm sort of like resistant to it, want to see sort of local, states' rights and municipal rights for most things, because if you start to spread federal police power out, that could be the architecture of something really grotesque in the future, coming from any party, right? And this is sort of concern that you and I both shared, I think, earlier on in the podcast. And yet, so yet from a sort of purely libertarian perspective, the violation of people's rights and the enhancement of their freedoms as a sort of core modality of thinking for us, not only is about the relationship of the government to the citizen and the sort of architecture of power around that, it is also about the relationship between different kinds of citizens. So the incentivizing of a criminal class by, say, we're not going to put you in jail for anything under $1,000, so go act with impunity. And so you get gangs just going out and raising hell and beating people up and looting stores and, you know, stealing and carjacking, and all of this stuff goes up. And so a very sort of pragmatic kind of a narcissist pragmatic type with a CEO mentality comes along, and that's Trump, and he says, well, I have the power, at least in the district, to deploy federal forces to help out. And it seems to have turned out to a good end for now, right? So I don't know what to think about that. I have the concern that dispersing federal power over the land in that manner risks creating an architecture of or concentrated federal power, police power in the states that I resist. But I also don't want crime to continue unabated as it has. What are we supposed to think about that as libertarians with something of a realist streak?
Yeah, it's good. I um haven't followed news about the reaction to the National Guard DC, so I don't know much about what its effects have been or how people have responded to it. I was troubled myself by the news that it was being done, but I haven't been able to follow the issue too closely. In sorry, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to go back to the abstract a little bit again.
Yeah, no, that's cool.
But in the abstract, right? This kind of harkens back to an issue that we raised at the beginning of the podcast, which is this issue of state capacity, right? So, like, if you concede that there are certain things that the state ought to do, then it is important that the state have the ability, the capacity to discharge those functions effectively. And if and to the extent that it doesn't, that's a problem, even from a kind of libertarian perspective, right? So, non-anarchist libertarians think that policing is one of the proper functions of the state, but in order for the state to police effectively, um, it's got to have the resources to do so, right?
Uh-huh.
And that means resources means a lot of things. It means personnel, it means proper training, it means proper um, access, right? That the police have to be able to kind of go where they need to go in order to do their jobs effectively. And part of that is a legal issue, just what the laws say, and part of it is more complicated, right? So after 2020, there was a real pullback in a lot of the country of policing from areas where police felt that they were likely to elicit complaints or public backlash if they exhibited too much of a presence, and so they pulled back, and crime rates in those areas increased.
Oh,
Uh,
they had their funding stripped too. So it was not merely that they wanted to cover their butts.
yeah,
It's also that they got massive funding stripped out. But
yeah,
please continue. Yeah.
yeah. So that's a real issue. Now what the best way of responding to that is, because there are a lot of different approaches you could take, right? Sending in the National Guard is one that was available to Trump, and so he took it. Was it the best option? I would kind of think not, but certainly. Um, I don't know. It's the problem. If you care about individual liberty, then I think you have to recognize that individual liberty can be violated not just by the government, but also by your fellow citizens. And one of the things that the government can do, if it's working well, is to protect people from those violations of liberty. And pure libertarian theory, as such, has really nothing to say about like who should be doing that enforcement, whether it should be federal agents or local police officers or county sheriffs or what. Like, there's nothing in Rothbard or Nozick about any of those questions. All that they say is like, the government should protect people's rights.
The world speaks in riddles, markets, politics, power, the very nature of consciousness itself. But what if there were guides, a secret fellowship dedicated to reading the signs, to building bridges between the seen and the unseen? The gray robes operate in the space others fear or cannot comprehend. We map the territory between spiritual awakening and practical revolution, between ancient wisdom and radical innovation. 12 dimensions guide us. One mission impels us. Find out more at grayrobes.org. That's grayrobes.org. Before we go, we have 5 minutes left. If you're game,
I'm game.
I want to return to this tough nut that is Social Security. And I picked on you a little bit for having used Social Security as one of the things that it's kind of immoral to cut. And I, basically, in the abstract, I said, well, if I'm being innervated and having my blood drawn by vampires so vampire can feed his little batlings, and I, having to be selective about whether and to what extent I'm removing the blood draw from my veins seems to me to be, understandable to a degree, but at the end of the day, my negative rights come before other people's positive rights. And then the example you gave, and I didn't like it, was Social Security, because that is a system that we're obliged all to pay into. So people's objections to reforming Social Security usually have to do with something to the effect of, I've paid into this system all the years. And what that left me with was not so much like, I didn't like that you used that example, because I thought it was a disanalogy to so many other things that are clearly direct violations of, my rights and freedoms, our rights and freedoms, that desperately needed reform. But this was a special case, and I wasn't left, sort of being upset with you because of that, the fact that it's a special case due to the fact that people are obliged to pay into it over the years. What I was left with was, man, this is a tough nut to crack from a reform perspective, and it is completely gobbling up the budget and is taking us further into the debt with growing unfunded liabilities and people who are living to be 80, 90 years old now. What do we do about that? And so I'm curious to get your thoughts, both on my objection to it. Do you see why I objected to it? But also, what do you think about reforming it?
Good. Yeah. I'm glad we're talking about this, because I actually think we maybe have less disagreement about Social Security than we do about a number of other issues. Right. So, I mean, both of us think that Social Security in an ideal world wouldn't exist as a government program, that people would fund their own retirement accounts with their own money based on their own individual choices and risk tolerance and what have you. The issue that I raised it in the context of an issue for shrinking the state, which is the issue of what I call reasonable expectations, which is, when you have the state doing something that you think it shouldn't do, nevertheless, in the course of doing it for year after year, decade after decade, the government establishes expectations on the part of people that it will continue to do it. And if it sort of just yanks the rug out from people in an instant, a lot of people's plans and expectations are going to be frustrated in a way that, can be really serious, right? I mean, so like if you're counting on Social Security for your retirement and you're like, 50 something years old, right? Then having that just disappear instantaneously can be really hard to recover from, depending on your financial situation. So I think like there's a question there of like how does the government deal with those kinds of issues of reasonable expectations? How do we factor those things in to thinking about the process by which the state ought to be shrunk or dismantled? Um, so um, so start with this idea of reasonable expectations, right? Because I think like it has different bite in different cases to
Yeah,
to go to your vampire
exactly.
case,
Yeah,
right? Like I think and I didn't like so you didn't like my social security example. I don't like your vampire example, right? Like I don't like examples like that as a kind of go-to libertarian talking point for talking about government programs. People often, a lot of other radical libertarians talk about slavery, right? It's like slavery is bad, right? If you're a slave, we shouldn't just kind of phase that out. We should end it immediately. And I'm like, yeah, well, like slavery is really slavery is really, really bad. Not every government program is like slavery, right? Even if it's like slavery in the sense that it violates somebody's rights in a way, there are lots of different ways of violating people's rights, and some of them are much more like morally troubling and unjustifiable than others, right? So, paying taxes to fund the child tax credit is a violation of rights according to most libertarians. It's nothing like slavery, right? It's nothing like being a slave. And so like having to fund that tax for an additional 5 years while we phase it out is nothing like asking you to remain a chattel slave for the
agreed.
next 5 years of your life,
Agreed.
right?
Yeah.
Like the moral cost benefit analysis there is just like way, way off. So,
And
so I think
the reason that I've found I hope you got the spirit with which this objection was intended
yes,
was not
yes,
that I didn't agree with you about the sort of tough nut that is Social Security, reasonable expectations in going into the future. I do. I think that it's something that needs to be phased out, even though it involves these sort of hidden or unseen, like Bastiat style, unseen rights violation or unseen. Um, well, and also because of the sort of onrushing problem of the national debt that will
yeah,
take us into either sovereign default or hyperinflation soon if we're not careful.
yeah,
I wish we had more time to talk about that as an issue, but then we're getting into the sort of systemic problems of where you press the balloon, as it were.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but I agree with you that ideally you'd want to phase it out, but we need to start phasing it out quickly. Otherwise, nobody's gonna have anything for retirement because sovereign default or hyperinflation or what have you, or both. And so my vampire analogy or shtick was designed to say, look, there's so many other issues on which we can immediately stop violating people's rights, even if and they're far more direct, where you're not obliging people to donate or to contribute their own money to it involuntarily over the years, and there's a reasonable expectation that they get it back. For example, people that have just become dependent on so much of the entitlement state, or the warfare state in general has all of um, these different interests who benefit directly from the status quo and from, under libertarian conception, rights violations. And that stopping those immediately while government military contractors expect to continue to be able to go to work making $10,000 bolts for tanks that are likely never to be used or whatever the military industrial complex justifies its existence with, that the reasonable expectations are just not there for so many of these others, and certainly
yeah.
shouldn't trump my rights for them to hand my kids the bill for all of it once it goes tits up.
Yeah, I 100% agree, right? So
Okay.
the
Yeah.
point of raising the Social Security example wasn't like this is what every government program is like.
Yeah.
It was to raise a case that I thought was particularly that raised that issue with particular salience, right? And where it made the case for a kind of reasonable expectation clearly. I
Yeah.
think the issue of reasonable expectations is kind of tricky, right? Because
Mm.
it's what exactly that means is not obvious, right? Like, you might have what we might call a reasonable expectation in the epistemic sense, like a probability judgment that such and such a program will continue, like slaveholders in 1859 might have had a very high and evidentially based estimate that the probability of slavery and continue for the next 10 years would be close to 100%. Doesn't justify
Mm-mm.
continuing the program because there's a moral dimension. It's not just an epistemic issue. There's a kind of moral dimension to what we call a reasonable expectation. So if you're doing something that is grossly violating people's rights, right?
Yeah.
Um, you don't have a reasonable expectation that will continue, even if it's very highly probable that it will
Well, and
continue.
it's sort of like, and this is kind of, what is it that sort of stokes your moral fires internally, right? So like, oh, poor people in we got to do sex change surgeries in Guatemala, or all the that the USAID was up to, which was just, you know, uh, I am pretty persuaded by the likes of Mike Benz, who is, sort of unearthed all of the kinds of shenanigans that CIA and its proxies, whether in NGOs or USAID, that is sort of like an intermediary distributor for CIA activities in an effort to either undermine countries, topple governments, and so it's just another modality of interventionism. Um, but a lot of it has a veneer of being like do-gooderism, like the world's not going to have charity for the poorest countries of the world if we don't go in and, give these NGOs millions of dollars to teach Afghani women about Western modern art. Just so much of that garbage that, and a lot of the objections was, well, these poor civil servants and NGO workers were going to be out of jobs, and millions of people in the developing world were going to die if we weaned them off these budgets. And it's just not true. What it is they wanted to stay on their gravy train, getting to do all this stuff because they are government sponsored do-gooders, and most of the good that they did, I don't find good, and I don't think most taxpayers find good. So like, that is an instance where it's like, nope, cut them off now. My rights are worth more than that. But that kind of like, those kind of like different moral priors. It's like, we have an obligation to help the poor, even if it means that we mandate you help them, rather than, you sort of, we're forcing you to outsource your responsibilities to distant capitals for global charity, is kind of the veneer that they put on that. And I find almost all of that stuff to be complete. But it makes me seem like, it makes someone who would like to restore the rights and the fiscal solvency and fiscal health of the country, back on some kind of like out of the sea of red ink or the red alert status. I think it's not, both in a consequentialist terms and in rights based terms, um not a bad objection. But in terms of like the way it gets cast and the way that they were able to scream when this stuff started happening during the first part of Doge, yeah, I'm still hooked up to the vampire, and so are you.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think that the question of the reasonable expectations, right, is going to, in order to determine whether a program should be phased out immediately or whether we should extend it out over a period of time, we want to look at both the cost of continuing that program, right, and the benefits that that program provides, as well as the availability of alternatives to that program, right? So maybe there are non-governmental alternatives to such and such thing that government currently does, that, if the government stops doing this next Friday, then the private sector can pick it up. All those kinds of facts are going to be relevant in determining
I don't
whether and
agree with that.
how. You
I
don't
don't
you
agree
don't
with
think those facts are relevant?
No, not at all.
Okay.
And the reason why I say that is that's where the accusation of Platonism comes from. That you imagine this sort of reflective space that is shielded or buffered from the exigencies of politics, that people can make these kind of sort of responsible weaning or planning or something like this. This is just not how politics works. It's not how DC works. These people are sociopaths in their own way. Most of them. There are enough sociopaths in DC, and even just good old hardworking quote unquote civil servants who don't want to lose their paychecks, that they will get organized and they'll push back and they'll keep it from ever happening. So the idea that there's going to ever be this moment where everybody's going to sit down and very calmly and patiently make these sorts of evaluations, I think I think it's Pollyannish and Platonist, frankly.
I don't know about that. I mean, all I'm saying is that whoever's cutting government programs ought to pay some attention to the benefits that those programs provide and the costs that they impose. And that, you ought to try to prioritize ones that have high cost, low benefit, and not the other way around. And if you don't, then
And
you wind
public
up doing
choice
stupid things.
and public
Then you
choice.
just do like I think the USAID stuff was kind of dumb. And like it's not just the USAID bureaucrats who are protesting the cuts here. I mean, there's a lot of independent researchers who attest that the excess deaths due to ending programs, and like, yeah, there's some dumb stuff, but like some stuff was based on like focused on malnutrition, clean drinking water, like tuberculosis, right? And these programs got cut in a way that's probably going to lead to between 500,000 to 1 million
I,
excess deaths.
I don't believe that. And enough of the USAID programs were preserved as it was folded into the Department of State. But this is an empirical question, right? So we can agree to disagree until the empirics surface. I guess what yeah, it's.
But the empirics have to matter, right? Like, I mean, I'm not saying we need to
But that
settle
was
the issue now.
prospective.
I'm not saying we need to, yeah, they're prospective,
You
but
can't. There's no such thing as prospective empirics.
you can make predictions
Right. Yeah, and
based on data.
it sounds like the predictions, just like the predictions that we were all going to be underwater by the year 2013, according to Al Gore. It's like, okay, well, your models were wrong, you were wrong, and it sounds like your funding was speaking for you. It's like, so like what I'm saying is quite literally you have to do retrospective in order to tell whether and it assumes a sort of stasis on the part of people who are receiving the programs. Maybe they self-organize in a different way. Maybe they like, oh, I really did benefit from this and find another way to get it. And there's a market created. I mean, we just don't know. But I'm not saying that I want to be super harsh about like denying people tuberculosis treatments or whatever without, if possible, and I agree that if possible, you could find a compassionate way to move that into the civil society sector or global charities, of which there are many. And instead of them doubling as, CIA front groups and all of the other crazy stuff that we have going on, that they actually serve their function of being, instead of political organizations, being charitable organizations as NGOs, that is what might actually happen and that might be okay. That being said, I guess the final point I would want to make on it is that there really, there's not going to be these transitions without pain, where sort of wise people who are completely unaffected by the dynamics of public choice are going to sit around and figure out a transition plan because we all agree that these need to be phased out. That's just never going to happen because politics doesn't work that way. I want to give you the last word.
You're probably right. Right? Like yeah, that's not the way that politics works. Right? But people do engage in planning. People do engage in prediction. Expert prediction is problematic in all kinds of ways that you and I both agree upon. But it's often we have no alternative to it, right? Like we have to make estimates of what the likely consequences of our policies will be and base our decisions on those estimates, right? It's like, where do we send the cops, right? It's like, what do we make the speed limit on certain roads? Like, what kind of safety standards do we impose upon airlines? Those are all questions that depend upon predicting the results of different decisions. Um, and so what I'm asking us to do in thinking about shrinking the government is nothing especially radical. It's that we engage in some kind of you know moral cost benefit calculation, and we go after those programs first, where we have some political viability, right? Which is a point that you make, which I think is important, right? We have to seize the moments that are available to us, and those might not always be the moments that we'd hoped for in our dreams, but of the things that are available to us, we should try to pick the low hanging fruit, pick the ones that are going to get us the biggest bang for our buck. I happen to think that's opening the borders is one of those things. That's an area where you and I maybe disagree, but ending occupational licensing is another one. Liberalizing housing policy, probably another where we might agree. There are lots of things that governments could get out of the way in, where it would not only not make things worse, it would make things much, much better. So let's start there, and then we can get to the more complicated, contentious stuff later.
I tell you, well, first of all, it's been a pleasure to have you talk to you today. I want to get you back sometime after we have some new things to discuss. And I want to thank you for coming today. This has been an absolute pleasure, and mixing it up with me the way you did. I hesitate if I came across too strong in my critical article, but I'm sure glad that it prompted this discussion. You are really a scholar and a gentleman. Thank you very much.
And Max, likewise, I really appreciate you being receptive to me, reaching out to you, hosting this podcast. This was very generous of you with your time and your energies, and it was a lot of fun. I feel like we could keep doing this for more hours, so I'd be happy to come back any point. This is a blast.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much.